I've been marking papers since 2004. Back then, Paul Martin was Prime Minister, George Bush II was president. Kanye West was opposed to the president. Facebook was still the Facebook, and nobody knew what it was. MySpace hadn't even peaked yet, so a couple of things have changed since then, but one thing that stayed the same since I started marking papers is some of the common problems that I tend to see in students' papers. Problems that I think stem mostly from bad communication more than anything else, or people assuming that other people see things the way they do, like by default or something. A lot of instructors have been doing this for so long that they start to kind of act as if people are born knowing how to do research and how to cite in their papers. And a lot of students come into this just assuming that, everything about the way they did it in high school still works in university. My name is Ryan James. I'm a PhD in anthropology. I teach anthropology. I teach urban studies, information studies. I've also taught criminology in the past. I've been a professor since 2015 and a TA since 2004, and I've made this video now in June 2020 to help fill the information gap that I've seen all along through my career as an instructor. And so this is aimed mainly at students who are completely new to post-secondary studies, but this would also be some useful tips for more advanced students as well. If you're a student in one of my courses, I assure you, you can follow this advice, and if you do that accurately, you can't go wrong. If you're not in my courses, these are some general tips and principles that should help you, but be sure to follow the rules of your specific assignment and check with your instructor for any of their specific preferences for things like style and formatting. So why do we cite? Well, there's a more meaningful answer than the one that you're probably used to. One answer is it's just what you have to do to get a decent mark. But again, a more meaningful way of looking at this is to go back to what the point of a university course is supposed to be in the first place. So what's the point of a university course? On one level, there's the harsh reality of our lives under capitalism. People take courses as one of about 20 to 30 pieces of a degree that will hopefully lead to better employment prospects than the ones that you started with. Maybe you have a really clear goal in mind. Maybe you know that this course counts as an elective in a program that you know will lead you right to the career that you want. Or maybe it's even clearer than that. Maybe this course is required for that program that will lead you right to the career that you want. But even if your goal is a bit less clear than either of these two scenarios, if you're not sure what you want to do after university, even in that scenario, there's still a direct use, for any one course that you're taking. It gets you credit, which you put towards a degree that you know you want for a specific reason. So on one level, we cite because of all that, right? We cite because we need to get decent marks. You need decent marks to pass courses. You need to pass courses to finish programs and get a degree. And you need that degree to boost your employment prospects. That's the reality of why a lot of people enroll in courses. And I'm not asking anybody to forget about that reality. But if this is the only way that you're viewing this process, it's probably not going to be very rewarding. In fact, it will probably be about as rewarding as, I don't know, doing data entry or stocking shelves at a store. You put the right things on the right shelf at that job because you're supposed to, and you do what you're supposed to do because that's what you have to do to get paid. So if you're approaching university courses like this, if you're only citing because you're supposed to, you're not being very creative probably, and if you want to do this really well and maybe even enjoy it, you're going to have to buy into things a little bit more, and that's what this first part of the video is about. So a university course, when done right, is supposed to be a conversation among scholars. It's kind of a serious conversation, and it's one in which people sometimes challenge each other, but it's one in which people are free to voice their own opinions, but it's expected that those opinions can be backed up with facts and that those opinions are actually relevant to the conversation of the specific course. But still, when it's done right, students aren't just writing papers to get them done and check the right boxes or, put the right things on the right shelves. Writing the papers are part of the conversation. That the papers are reflections on the material in the syllabus. They combine that material with outside research and with the students' own thoughts, and that adds something to the conversation. which is very similar to what professors also do with each other. So if you go to an academic conference, it works kind of the same way. There's like a central theme to the conference, so everybody who shows up is expected to have at least some familiarity with that theme, those key ideas, and to comment on them. And then people at the conference share their work, they talk about it, and each individual person's work is a small extension of or an expansion upon those central themes of the conference. So really, it's not unlike when a professor tells a group of, say, 50 students to write a paper or an exam question about a central topic. Let's take, for example, the topic of gender roles. The assignment is based on a central topic, and so students take that topic in their own direction with their individual papers. One student might write a paper about gender roles in Samoa. Somebody else might write a paper about gender roles in the United States. Someone else compares the gender roles of the 1950s to the gender roles of the present, and so on. Each student taking their own direction with this central theme that is the assignment instructions. All that to say is my advice to you is to try to see yourself in those terms. You're a scholar taking part in a conversation, not just a student who's trying to follow instructions to get a pretty good mark. And maybe taking this approach will stick. Some people do adopt that outlook, and they end up going to grad school and then end up teaching university. So some students will eventually go pro in that sense. But even if you have no intention of ever becoming a professional scholar, I still think it's worthwhile to kind of try that role on while you're here at university. Because if you think of any other, pursuit or hobby, like I don't know, playing basketball. If you play basketball with your friends or at like a local league in a community center, I'm pretty sure most people in that game know damn well they're probably not going to the NBA. But everybody still plays to win, right? Or if you're a gamer, it's kind of the same thing. How many people playing your online game will eventually become these famous YouTube celebrities who get watched by millions of people playing their games, which I still can't understand the appeal, but that's just me. Age gap, generation gap, maybe. The point is, probably nobody playing your game is expecting to become a famous YouTube celebrity, but I'm going to guess that it's more interesting if everyone kind of acts like it and really, really plays to win, right? So step one, I think, in how to cite properly is, to play to win. If you're watching this video because you're in a university course, the fact that you're in a university course already makes you a scholar. You're part of a scholarly conversation, and the more you put into it, the more you get out of it. But now back to some harsh reality. I meant it when I said that it's a conversation. That's completely true. And everyone in the conversation is a scholar of various types. But it's also a very unequal conversation in terms of how much weight and how much respect people's ideas get. Because the reality is, knowledge in academia is ranked. It is a hierarchy. And I think there are some good reasons for some of that, which I'll explain a bit later. But in other ways, yes, it is definitely elitist, and that elitism is a reality that still irritates me even after I've spent almost 20 years in academia. So what I'm about to show you is not necessarily how I think things should be, but in my view, it's the way they are, and I think that's a good thing to know because it can help you get more out of the conversation. And at the same time, learn more about how and why to cite in papers, which is the main point of this video that I promise I'll get to soon. But for now, look at this. This is my model of how we rank knowledge in academia. I'll take a couple of minutes to explain this, and then we'll get down to the main topic of citations after that. At the very top of the pyramid, the most respected voices in the conversation, I have the scholars who I will call the paradigm shifters. These are the big names whose ideas changed everything in the social sciences at their time. For example, the three that I quoted in Making Sense of a Changing World, episode 5, the religion episode, I talked about Durkheim, Marx, and Weber, and I've added a couple other names who you may have heard of, and if not, then you definitely will before you finish your degree, Antonio Gramsci and Michel Foucault. This is abstract philosophy that looks at questions like, what is the meaning of life and how does society work? And the thinkers on this level are the big names that for one reason or another changed how people look at these questions. A lot of what they wrote is headache inducing, so you don't read much of it in a first year course, but everything that you do read was influenced by at least one of these thinkers to at least some extent, and in upper year courses you will start to read them directly. And anybody doing research in the social sciences is expected to at least say something about some of these thinkers at some point, whether implicitly or explicitly. As you may have noticed, a lot of these thinkers are men, especially white men, especially dead white men. And all of this is part of the Eurocentric bias of academia that is being challenged every day. So again, I'm not saying that I like this setup or that I endorse it at all. For now, I'm just describing how it is. One step below them are key thinkers in the discipline. Every discipline has them. Psychology has its own, sociology has its own, geography, etc. I mostly teach anthropology, and most people watching this video as a result will probably be anthropology students, so I'm going to use anthropology as my example. These are people who may not have had a huge impact outside the discipline. In some cases they did, but not necessarily. But they definitely had a huge impact inside of it. People like Franz Boas or Malinowski or Clifford Geertz. Also very influential voices, but not quite as influential as the paradigm shifters. They may have had a huge impact in their discipline, but not as much reach outside of it. So in their day, they could have been treated like celebrities at an anthropology conference, but outside that conference, maybe not many people knew who they were. And so these figures, as part of this conversation I'm describing, they would have read the paradigm shifters when they were in school, and they were influenced by their work, by at least some of their work, to at least some extent. Moving down one level, in the middle of the pyramid now, we have professors, people with PhDs who teach at post-secondary institutions and who write articles and books and now make videos, apparently, mostly for other professors and for students. These are people like me whose ideas haven't really, revolutionized the discipline. They certainly haven't changed society, but we're still considered professionals, and the things that we write are still considered legit, reliable research. Most of the work that you would read in a first-year course, for example, is probably written by people in this range. Textbooks are usually written by people in this range. So in this position, we are expected to use the ideas of the paradigm shifters, the key thinkers, and our fellow professors, use that to inform our work, and in turn, students are expected to use our ideas and our interpretations of the paradigm shifters and the key figures in students' essays. Down one level on the hierarchy are graduate students, people working on master's degrees or PhDs. They are expected to cite professors, key figures in the discipline, and also to cite and to think deep thoughts about the paradigm shifters. Graduate students do original research, and they can get published in academic journals, just like professors can. And so some of the required readings in some courses are indeed written by graduate students. Probably not any textbooks, but likely some of the articles. So graduate student is the first level at which you're seen as a producer of knowledge, not just someone who's here to learn, but also someone who's able to produce things that other students and professors can learn from. So at most universities, TAs are graduate students. Some professors are also graduate students, as I was during my first 2 years of being a professor. And just as an aside, I don't miss anything about that. Trying to finish a PhD while teaching courses, not an easy time, but here I am. And finally, you probably saw this coming, and I mean no disrespect whatsoever in saying this, but at the bottom of the hierarchy, at least for now, are undergraduate students. Traditionally, undergraduates were seen as consumers of knowledge. Your job was to take knowledge from professors and key figures in the discipline, and in some cases graduate students, and use that knowledge to rethink and expand upon your own prior knowledge. Usually in most undergrad courses, especially at the early years, you won't read many of the paradigm shifters directly, but you might in some upper year courses, as I said. But still, all that aside, you're still part of the conversation. It's just that your role in the conversation is mostly seen as one of consuming knowledge and applying it to particular areas. So the point of coursework, the point of every essay, every take-home exam, every little participation exercise is to demonstrate that that's what you're doing. You're fulfilling your role in the conversation. And the point of citing material in all that coursework is to demonstrate that you're doing so accurately and thoughtfully. And that's what a lot of your grades are based on. But the larger purpose is, ideally, you do this somewhere between 20 or 30 times over a few years. You take 20 or 30 courses roughly towards an undergraduate degree. Ideally, that adds up to a lot of new knowledge and a lot of new ways of looking at knowledge And at that point, you're eligible to level up to graduate student, crossing over that threshold into producer of knowledge and a new role in the conversation. So even if you have no intention of going to grad school, I recommend approaching your courses as if that is your plan, because, why not? What's the worst that could happen? You put more into it and you get more out of it. That's kind of the worst case scenario of approaching your courses as if you do one day want to be in graduate school. Just like a sports game or a board game or a video game, it's more interesting if everybody tries to win, right? And maybe you'll even find that it really works and you will end up in grad school even if you hadn't planned on it at first. But to return to what I was saying earlier, this is a very hierarchical system. It's elitist in many ways. I think there are some legitimate reasons for some aspects of the hierarchy, but not the elitism. I think undergrads are capable of more than just consuming knowledge. You can also produce it. And over the past few years, there's been a move towards more creative approaches to teaching that focus on undergraduates' ability to produce knowledge. But still, in almost every course that you take in the social sciences or in the humanities, there will inevitably be, research papers, take-home exams that require you to, demonstrate that you've consumed knowledge from the course and that you can apply it to your own thinking. And those are the kind of assignments that this video is geared towards helping you through. So back to this question of why the hierarchy. The high status that some voices in the conversation are given is largely based on the fact that what they write has been peer reviewed, and that's the crucial difference between an academic source and a non-academic source, is the peer review process. And you'll notice that most, if not all, of your courses will require you to use academic sources in most, if not all, of your assignments. Academic is another way of saying peer reviewed in this case, which means the article or the book has been checked over by an anonymous panel of experts before it gets published. So the knowledge creator, usually a professor or a graduate student, will do some original research and then write about it. They will then take their findings, blend it with some ideas based on what other professors and some of the key theorists have said about similar topics, and then write that up into an article submission. Then it gets reviewed by an anonymous panel, anonymously. No one in the process knows who each other is, so that's to prevent any chance of favoritism or patronage or even revenge or anything else. It doesn't mean that it's fun. It's actually at times a very intimidating process, as I've tried to illustrate with this very serious graphic. You get a lot of constructive criticism out of this process, but at times you also get some harsh criticism, maybe even some kind of salty comments and snide remarks as well. Peer review definitely serves its purpose, but it's not necessarily fun. Sometimes the paper gets rejected outright. It's almost never accepted in the first round. More often, typical result is the panel identifies a couple of significant problems and a few small ones with the original submission, sends it back to the author, and the author is told to revise and resubmit. They take some time to do that. They send it back again. Often there is another round of corrections, and eventually it's deemed worthy of publication, and it gets published sometime after that. So the first thing that you might notice or assume about this, and you would be right, is this whole process is really slow. Everything I just described, that takes a total of anywhere from several months to, in some cases, a few years. So, unlike journalism, the point of academic research is not to get the scoop and break the news and tell people what's happening right now. Academics don't break any stories, but they do provide some very deep and very careful reflections on and context for those stories, and we can use that to help us make sense of other more current events. So, for example, I'm recording this on June 26, 2020. You're not going to find a lot of peer-reviewed academic literature on, for example, the wave of uprisings following the murder of George Floyd. People are studying that, but it's so recent there hasn't been time to review or publish those studies yet. But for example, you will find a lot of academic literature on the protests that happened after Michael Brown was killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, because there's been time for that work to get through the peer review process and get published. And a lot of that work will certainly be relevant to thinking about the current situation. So the weakness is it's slow. The strength is it's very rigorously checked for quality. That doesn't mean that everything that goes through peer review is some kind of truth that you are obligated to agree with. Scholars debate, they challenge each other, they poke holes in each other's research and arguments. Peer review just means that it's gone through a few rounds of very rigorous scrutiny that, ideally most of the time ensures that it's at a certain baseline of quality. And the bar for that is really, really high. It's quite hard to get published in academia. So the reason why you have to cite academic sources in your papers and on your take-home exams is not because those sources are the truth or because they're perfect. It's because they're part of the conversation that you're here to take part in. The point of a university course is not to, write up your own opinions based on what you read in a magazine or a newspaper or on Wikipedia. There's nothing wrong with those sources necessarily. It's just that your reflections on them, that belongs on your your Twitter feed or your blog or your vlog or whatever. It's not what you're being graded on in a university course. Instead, what you are being graded on is your ability to take in peer-reviewed material, blend that content with your prior knowledge and other peer-reviewed stuff that you've read, and put that together into a somewhat short piece of writing that extends the conversation in your own direction. In other words, it's being a scholar. So that's the big picture significance of citations. It's giving your opinions some added weight. It's giving you the weight of the peer-reviewed process behind your opinions, and it's showing your instructor that you're taking the conversation seriously and really trying to push it forward in your own way. As for how to tell if something is academic and how to find it, that's a whole other topic that's kind of beyond the scope of this video. Your university library can certainly help with that. But for now, I just want to focus on what to do with those sources once you have them. For example, the sources that appear on your course syllabus. So that was why to cite. Now let's look at how to cite. And again, this is aimed at people who are completely new to this, but there are a couple more advanced tips that come up a bit later in the video, towards the end, I should say, that might be of use to the more experienced students. But back to the basics, a good place to start is talking about quoting versus paraphrasing. Both of these are good writing strategies. Both have a time and a place, and in both cases you need citations always. What is quoting? That's pretty obvious. That's when you take material word for word from another source and put it in quotation marks. And I think most people are already aware when they start university that when you do that, when you quote material, you need to say where you got it from. But I'll repeat that and I'll say some more about quoting a bit later. For now, I'll talk about paraphrasing first because I think paraphrasing is the more challenging of the two. Paraphrasing is when you take an idea or a piece of data from another source and put it in your own words. It's a surface level change. So when material that you have paraphrased, that is not your original thought, it's not data that you found through your own research, you're taking what someone else said or found and you're restating it for your own purposes. Now, when this is done properly, especially with a citation, this is an excellent writing strategy. It's an appropriate thing to do in the conversation because when you paraphrase, you're showing that what you're saying, your own thoughts, that's supported by something else that was found or said by an expert. And that's why you have to cite it as well. And I'll show you how to actually do that in a minute. But for now, I just want to address this one crucial point that often gets lost amidst all the miscommunication. It seems like some people get out of high school thinking that paraphrasing makes it your own work, like because you've restated it, that you don't need to cite the source anymore, that somehow by restating it, rewording it, it's now become your idea or your data. And this is a huge misconception because paraphrasing without a citation, it's plagiarism. It's plagiarism just as much as quoting without a citation is, and most instructors will treat it as such. So if you paraphrase without citing, you will likely get a 0 on the assignment, maybe a 0 in the course, and maybe worse, depending on your university's policies and whether or not you've done it in the past. But paraphrasing with a citation is an excellent writing strategy, so let's look at an example of how to do it properly. So here's our example. Let's look at the first few lines of this article. It's a good scholarly source. It's on one of my course syllabuses, an article called "The Beautiful Game, Hegemonic Masculinity, Women in Football in Brazil and Argentina," by David Wood. It's from a good academic journal, the Bulletin of Latin American Research. It was published in 2018. The content of this article, for our purposes here in this video, the content doesn't matter. I just want to show you how to cite material using this as an example, but just if you're curious, this is a study of women playing and watching football. And by football, we're talking about association football, what we call soccer in North America. So women in that sport over the past century in Brazil and Argentina, and the paper makes the argument, I'm really doing this in a nutshell, it's a lot more complicated than this, but it's basically saying that women's increased participation in that sport is empowering, at least in some ways. So here's a screenshot of the first few lines of that article. It begins, "Football in Latin America has become firmly established as a subject of study for historians, sociologists, anthropologists, and literary scholars, especially in relation to Argentina and Brazil. But the great majority of publications arising from such work focuses entirely on the game as played by men." So what is David Wood saying in the intro to his article? Basically that people have been studying soccer in Latin America for years, but almost exclusively men's soccer. So this is the point that I want to include in my own work. On the next screen, I will show you an example of how not to do this. So this is what you don't do. Pretend this is what I hand in as the first paragraph of my own essay. And I write, "This essay will address gender biases in research on professional sports. Football in Latin America, for example, has become firmly established as a subject of study for historians, sociologists, anthropologists, and literary scholars, especially in relation to Argentina and Brazil, but the great majority of publications arising from such work focuses entirely on the game as played by men. By comparison, research on figure skating has tended to highlight women's roles in the sport." So, let's say I just put that passage directly in my essay with no citations or anything. How would that go? Would that do the job? Hell no, don't ever do that. That would get you busted for plagiarism. That's a 0 on the paper and maybe even worse. So don't ever do what I just did on that last screen. Maybe in that case I just made a mistake, but maybe I was trying to pass off David Wood's thoughts as my own, which is a kind of intellectual theft, and it's the worst thing you can do in this conversation that we call a university course. So that was an example of plagiarism. Paraphrasing without citations is plagiarism. Don't ever do it. What are some things I could have done in that case, though? Well, I want to start to answer that by talking about why I want to include David Wood's thought in my own writing. It's because what he's saying is a good example of the point that I'm trying to make, and so it's a good writing strategy for me to include it as long as I give him appropriate credit for coming up with it, which I can do like this in this example coming up. Here's an example of what you should do. I write, instead of what I had on the last image, I write, "This essay will address gender biases in research on professional sports. Football in Latin America has been widely studied by social scientists, for example, but the research focuses overwhelmingly on men's participation in the sport." And there's my citation, which I'll explain a bit later, in brackets, Wood 2018, page 567, and then back to my own writing. "By comparison, research on figure skating has tended to highlight women's roles in the sport." So, not to brag, but what I just did in that paragraph, that is an example of perfect paraphrasing. So, let's look at the anatomy of perfect paraphrasing. What I did there was take David Wood's original words and restate them in my own words, and in doing so, I only included the parts of David Wood's passage that actually support the point that I'm making. And then I gave David Wood credit with that citation in brackets. So I'm using his thought and his data to support my point, which is fine because I'm acknowledging that it's his thought and his data, which is exactly what you're supposed to do in this conversation. Just to break down some details, that citation that you see is an in-text Chicago citation, which is one of dozens of styles in which you can do this. It's the style that I use because I'm an anthropologist, and anthropology mostly settled on Chicago a few years ago. But again, check with your instructor as to what style they prefer. Some people have really strong preferences for style. I think the best practice is to let students work with whatever style they're most familiar with, as long as they do it right and consistently. But not everybody is as accommodating as me. Anyway, this is what an in-text citation looks like in Chicago style. So after the point that is cited from the source, after the few words that replicate what the original source said, It begins with that first bracket. That's the author's last name, and then a space, year of publication, comma, another space, the page number that the point I cited came from, close the brackets, and put a period. Now, on that note, very minor point, but the period does indeed go after the citation. That's a very common mistake. Some people put the period before the brackets, some put a period before and after the brackets. In this style, we just need one period that comes after the last bracket. A bit later in the video, I'll show you an example of how I could have done something like this even better. But for now, let's look at one more example of what not to do. So for that, let's go back to the original passage for a second. And at the bottom of the screen is the example of one thing that you also should not do. So this is a bad example. Don't do this. I write, football in Latin America has become firmly established as a subject of study for historians, sociologists, and anthropologists and literary scholars, especially in relation to Argentina and Brazil. But the great majority of publications arising from such work focuses entirely on the game as played by men. And then I have in brackets, Wood 2018, 567. Brackets end, next sentence. By comparison, research on figure skating has tended to highlight women's roles in the sport. That was also a fail. Why is it so bad? Well, I mean, I've given credit. There's at least a citation in there, but I didn't change anything. I didn't really paraphrase. I just copy and pasted from the article and then pasted in a citation. So because there are no quotation marks there, I think this one is also really, it's dishonest. I mean, I did give credit. I'm not trying to pretend that I wrote this. I'm attributing it to David Wood. So for that reason, a lot of instructors might give you a break in this case, but it still involves passing those words off as if I wrote them really. It looks like it's a paraphrase, but it's not. So this is also a very bad writing strategy. Because good paraphrasing doesn't just mean copying and then adding a citation. It means focusing on the point that you actually need from the source and restating it in your own words and integrating that into your paragraph. And of course, giving credit to the author with a citation that includes the page number. That's of course always a key part of paraphrasing properly. So let's move on to quotations, how to do them and why you quote material directly. So for that, I want to look at a different passage of the same article, and after I show you how to quote, I'll explain why I chose this passage to quote from. This comes from the same article, page 568. It's a bit of a long passage, but I need the length to illustrate the point. So the passage begins, the Brazilian Seleção is the only national team from the region to reach the latter stages of the FIFA Women's World Cup, third place in 99, runner-up in 07, or the Olympic Games, silver medal in 04 and 08, fourth place in Rio 2016, although Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Mexico have performed increasingly strongly in international competition over the last decade. Against such a background, Brazil and Argentina will constitute the primary focus of this study. The manner in which football has acquired a high degree of cultural capital in these nations in particular, thereby occupying a central place in the exploration of modern nationhood, makes the recent prominence of women in football all the more significant and challenging. So that's the original quote. I know it was long, but I need all of that to illustrate the point that I'm making. Appreciate your patience. Anyway, here is a quote that I would pull from this and insert into my own writing. It's coming up in a second. I'll show you how first, and then I'll explain why. And my piece of writing goes, Wood notes that in Brazil and Argentina, comma, quotation mark, football has acquired a high degree of cultural capital in these nations in particular, thereby occupying a central place in the exploration of modern nationhood. End quote, the citation, and the period. So what I just showed you, that passage on the screen, that is academically honest. It is done properly. It's good writing, but it's not great writing. And I'll explain why it's good but not great later. But for now, let me show you the anatomy of an acceptable quotation. So you can see in this example how it's mixed in with my own words a little bit. I start with my own words, which are Wood notes that in Brazil and Argentina. And then the quotation mark appears because that's where Wood's words begin. And Wood's words are, football has acquired a high degree of cultural capital in these nations in particular, thereby occupying a central place in the exploration of modern nationhood. End quote. So the material in quotation marks, that is word for word from the article, but it's okay. I'm allowed to do that because I've given Wood credit and I've shown what page the quote came from. And just like in the last example, that citation is a Chicago in-text citation. I placed the end quote right after the last word that was taken from Wood, and then a space, bracket, author's last name, space, year published, comma, space, page number the quote appears on, end quote, and period. So that's it. I'm done. That's completely legal. It's an academically honest citation. The short answer is you quote when you can't say it better yourself. So in that case, the quote was, football has acquired a high degree of cultural capital in these nations in particular, thereby occupying a central place in the exploration of modern nationhood. So that quote is already very concise. It already says exactly what I need it to say. And it includes some theoretical concepts that can't be easily paraphrased, like cultural capital and modern nationhood. Just to clarify a bit, again, we're not going to worry about content. I'm just showing examples of how to work with material, but may as well describe it anyway. Cultural capital basically means that, you know, football is respected and it's a powerful part of the culture of these countries. And modern nationhood basically means there's a particular way of being patriotic or feeling like you belong to a country that is specific to the modern era, arguably. So those parts are included in the quote because they are things that I couldn't have said better myself, and this is kind of the author's authentic voice that we want to keep here, and it's okay that I've copied word for word because it's brief, it's in quotation marks, and I've given credit where credit is due. Now in practice, it's not always a straightforward or easy judgment call to decide between paraphrasing or quoting. It's something that comes with practice, but as long as you are giving credit where credit is due, you really can't go too wrong when making that decision between quoting or paraphrasing, but it's a good place to start thinking about it in these terms. You quote when you can't possibly make it any more concise, or if the author's original voice needs to come through here, or if there are kind of theoretical concepts that can't be easily paraphrased. Now again, that was good but not great writing. Why not great? Well, it's a bit simplistic, it's a bit awkward, it leaves out some info that may have been helpful. The best academic writing includes paraphrasing, quoting, and the author's own words all in the same paragraph, and it moves smoothly between them. So let me show you an example of how I might mix quoting and paraphrasing to make this passage more complete and more appealing to the reader. So here's the original passage again, and it's on the screen. I won't read the whole thing out again, but if you need a refresher, maybe hit pause and just read it to yourself. What I'm trying to illustrate is that it begins with a lot of detail that the reader of your essay probably doesn't need to know, because the topic isn't, Latin American soccer stats. The topic is gender roles and sports. So you don't need to include, how many times the Brazilian seleção made the Women's World Cup, for example, and that's why I did not quote that part of the passage. And this part that's highlighted here, this is the brief explanation that Wood's paper focuses on Brazil and Argentina. And finally, the part that I did quote is highlighted here, and there's a bit after that that I left out. And now let me show you a better way to handle this quote. So here's a new piece of writing. This is my own writing, but it's based on Wood's article, and so it cites Wood's article appropriately, and it's a mix of paraphrasing and quoting as required. And it begins, Wood's study focuses on women's soccer in Brazil and Argentina because, quote, football has acquired a high degree of cultural capital in these nations in particular, thereby occupying a central place in the exploration of modern nationhood, end quote, citation, period. Wood argues that this, quote, makes the recent prominence of women in football all the more significant and challenging, end quote, comma, noting the success of the Brazilian seleção in particular, and then another citation. That's the passage. Now in that passage, I managed to include a lot more detail while also giving full credit to Wood, and I accomplished that through a mix of paraphrasing and quoting. I paraphrased the parts that can be summarized and in which each detail is not crucial to what I'm trying to say. So in this case, how many times the Brazilian women's team won and what other countries have had especially strong women's teams. I don't need all the details of that to make my point, so I've paraphrased that, I've summarized it. And I have quoted the stuff that, as explained, is crucial and that can't be said any better than it was already said. And in both cases, whether I quoted or paraphrased, I have credited the author and noted the pages that the material came from. So this is a very useful part of the conversation. We're talking about research on women in sports, and I've distilled the main points of one article on that topic into a couple of sentences. And this means that I can back up my own points with the work of a more established scholar, a professor, which is the exact role in the conversation that undergraduate students are expected to play, and that's why this passage is an ideal piece of undergraduate writing. So those were some basics of how and why to cite. If you're brand new to this, it should be enough of a start to get used to the concept and hopefully feel a bit more at home in a university course. But there's lots more I could have covered, and I'll get into a bit more of it at the end of this video. But for now, I wanted to make a couple of more points about my idea of the conversation. So like I said earlier, the point of coursework is to show that you're playing the role in the conversation that is expected of you as an undergraduate student. And that role is consuming knowledge, applying it in particular areas. And I think this is one of the most commonly overlooked things about assignments, because my most common critique, the thing that I write the most on students' papers, is that it needed more connection to course material. So in this case, the assignment is to write an essay about gender roles, but it's not to write just anything about gender roles based on just any sources. It's to write an essay about gender roles that is informed by the content of the course. And that's always the case in really every assignment in the social sciences. You're not just writing about the topic, you're writing about what the course material can begin to tell you about the topic and how you can extend that based on a bit of your own research and take it in your own direction. I think that point is usually very badly explained to students, or just not explained at all. It's often taken for granted that you know that, which isn't fair, and that's why I'm making a point of telling you in this video. So if it's an anthropology course, and that's the example that we're working with, and the assignment is to write about gender roles, that means I want to know what anthropologists have said about gender roles. Not so much psychologists, not so much political scientists, not so much film scholars. Those are all legit voices as well, but in this particular assignment, I want to know what anthropologists have said about gender roles and how you've consumed that knowledge and what you're doing with it in your own paper. And if I've given you a syllabus that includes a couple of sources by anthropologists on gender roles, then I really want to know what you think about those sources, because that's part of what I want out of this conversation. I want to see that you're working with the course material, that you're using it to rethink your prior knowledge, and also using your prior knowledge to critique the course material, and bringing those things that you found into the conversation. So always check the instructions of the assignment, but generally you want to say something about at least some of the course readings in everything you write in that course, unless you've been explicitly told not to. Almost done. Last couple of points. One is that I often get asked about citing lectures, how to cite lectures, whether you should cite lectures. As for how to cite lectures, well, the style guide of whatever style you're using should describe that, so I'm not going to get into too much detail on it. As for whether it's a good idea, again, check with your instructor. My usual advice is that if it's a point that's covered in lecture but not in any course readings, then you should go ahead and cite the lecture. But if the piece that you want to cite involves your professor summarizing a point from the course readings, it looks a lot more professional and thoughtful if you go to the course readings yourself and cite those using the techniques that I outlined earlier. But again, check the assignment instructions and check with your instructor. Sometimes there are specific rules and requirements on citing lectures. I think in general it's not a bad thing to do in a first or second year course, but professors don't cite each other's lectures, right? And the point, like I've been saying, the point of this is to play to win, right? To act as much like a professor as possible, or at least a grad student, and they don't really cite lectures either. So, you know, in beginner courses, it's okay to cite lectures, but if you can find the material in the course readings, cite those instead, and that should definitely be your practice in third and fourth year. Another question I often get is citing textbooks, whether that's a good idea. Citing textbooks is usually completely fine in a first year course, but similar as with citing lectures, in upper year courses, it's much better to avoid textbooks and cite articles or monographs instead. So a monograph, basically a full-length book written by a professor on one particular topic, because textbooks are also sort of an entry-level source. They are a beginner-level orientation to a given topic. They are written by professors who have put together what they think are the main points of their field, and they've distilled it into a readable format for beginners. So they're a great source for students who are just beginning a new topic, but the goal of early year courses is to develop the research and the literacy skills that it takes to, you know, find original full-length academic sources, so that you're citing those instead in your third and your fourth year, because you no longer need somebody to break things down into a textbook format for you. We're getting close to the end. Consider this next piece a bonus point for those who have made it all the way to the end of this video. I appreciate your time and your patience. I highly recommend investing plenty of time into your works cited page. Don't just leave it until the last 2 minutes before the deadline and then, copy and paste the names of the books you cited from websites and then leave things in a bunch of mismatched fonts with parts of it hyperlinked and parts of it not. A lot of instructors, inside tip, a lot of instructors look at the works cited page first before they look at anything else. So if your works cited page is incomplete or if the formatting's a mess, that's really not a good look. You don't want your instructor to start off looking at your paper with that kind of that tone. Quick review of some highlights. The point of citing is not just to give the authors credit, it's also to give yourself credit for having read their work and used their work to strengthen or otherwise influence your own ideas, to show that you are an active member of this conversation that we call a university course. Paraphrasing always needs a citation, contrary to what you may have gotten away with in high school. You most often paraphrase when you're summarizing some data or an idea that you are using to support your own point. Quotes also always need a citation. Usually you quote when the passage is already succinct enough or if it includes ideas that cannot be easily paraphrased. Next major point, invest the time in getting your works cited page correct and clean and right and everything in the same font. And last point I'll emphasize is always make sure that your written work is a part of the conversation that's specific to that course. And often the best way to do that is by citing some relevant material from the course syllabus. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope this was helpful. You can email me with questions, 416anthropology@gmail.com, or you can post them in the comments. And in a few seconds, I'll come back with a more advanced sample of a paragraph to show you some more advanced citation techniques. So this next clip is, it contains a few more advanced tips for more experienced students. And for this, I'm using an actual piece of writing. So not a hypothetical example like the Brazilian soccer one from earlier in the video. This is an excerpt from my own PhD dissertation. And again, this video is not about the content, so I won't say much about it, but just to give you the context, my dissertation, it was a study of a low-income neighborhood in Toronto, so an historical ethnography of this particular neighborhood. And this comes from a chapter about the early 2000s, basically, and so this excerpt I'm showing you is kind of summarizing the political context, so things that were happening in Toronto at the time that affected everyday life in that neighborhood. Now, there's lots more I can say about the content, but I won't because this video is about how to cite, so let's move on to those citation tips. I'll just start to read this passage and then I'll pause at parts where I have something kind of useful to say in terms of how and why to cite. So it begins, the previous chapter addressed how the province of Ontario and concomitantly the newly created megacity of Toronto were restructured according to neoliberal ideology by the conservative provincial government of the late 1990s. Now, there's no citations there because this is a chunk of a much larger work, and in this case, that first sentence, I'm just summarizing what I did in my own chapter a few pages before this appeared, so that doesn't need a citation. Picking up from the second sentence, in 2003, two separate elections brought the provincial and municipal governments closer to the political center. Provincially, the Liberal Party formed a majority government by winning 72 of 103 seats. Municipally, the mayoralty election of the same year was won by David Miller, an environmentalist lawyer backed by organized labor, period. And I've highlighted some of that because this sentence is... I think I found myself in a bit of a gray area, and it looks like I got away with it. This chunk, it probably could have used a citation or two. The fact that the Liberals won 72 seats in that election, that is a fact that's, kind of common knowledge. It's like an undisputable number that can be verified, by multiple sources anywhere, but it probably could have used a citation. And by describing David Miller as an environmentalist lawyer backed by organized labor, those were true things. But, you know, I've made a decision as to what to call David Miller in a way that supports the kind of the narrative that I'm working with in this paragraph. Also, maybe could have used a citation, but in this case, I got away with it. The point is, there are these gray areas, and, you know, as long as you're not deliberately copying someone else's work, you'll probably be okay. But the more citations, the better, and, you know, self-critique is always good. I probably should have dropped a citation in there. Anyway, I got away with it. Here I am. Let's keep moving. So, next sentence. With regards to these developments in local electoral politics and political culture, some have referred to the dominant ideology of Toronto in this period as third-way urbanism. And you notice the next citation, which I've highlighted, I have Jackson 2009 and Kyle 2000. I'll pause for a second, and what I'll say about that citation is, you know, it's an obvious point that I've noted two sources in one, and you can do that because in this case, both of those sources use this idea of third-way urbanism to describe the politics of Toronto as of, like, the year 2000, basically. And like I said, I can get away with that because both those sources are saying that, and I'm illustrating the point that multiple sources are using this concept. And one other thing I'll say about that citation, that double citation, is you'll notice there are no page numbers there, and that's because what I'm doing in that sentence is summarizing everything about those pieces. I'm not just pointing to one specific point or piece of data in an article. I'm summarizing kind of the totality of everything those authors said with their articles, and so for that reason, I can refer to those articles as a whole with no page number, and it's perfectly fine. Again, it's a bit of a gray area, a fine distinction, but in this case, it worked, and that's how you do it. Continuing after the semicolon. And others have called this, quote, neoliberal urbanism. And I've done the exact same thing in that next double quote. And then period, next sentence. In short, the welfare state remained marginal, and social policy continued to emphasize, quote, more self-reliance in the creation of wealth, end quote. And that one is given the page number citation because, as covered, I have quoted directly, word for word, a short passage from the original article, and that short passage is already as succinct as it could be, and it already does what I need it to do. So instead of paraphrasing, I drop in the exact word for word quote. And then after the semicolon, the excesses of social polarization, quote, were tempered through government intervention and, quote, metropolitan plans, ellipses, ... designed to be both competitive and socially inclusive. And then my next citation comes in brackets with the page number. One thing I'll highlight there, I didn't mention this in the earlier parts of the video. You are allowed to make slight modifications to exact quotes if you indicate them with the right punctuation. And if you do so in a way that does not change the meaning or the intent of the original passage, it just makes it fit what you're doing grammatically. So in this case, those ellipses, the 3 dots, that means I've chopped something out. There were a couple of words in there that were grammatically correct or useful in the original source that are not useful in my paragraph, and so I am allowed to chop them out by indicating it with the 3 dots. You can also do things like, I haven't done it in this passage, but you can insert a couple of words here and there to make the grammar flow properly, as long as you put those in square brackets indicating that it was your insertion. All right, on to the next, last sentence of this paragraph. Though dominant, this ideology was limited in reach, as illustrated by the election of the right-wing populist Rob Ford as mayor in 2010. And then I have a citation, Filion 2011. And again, that last point, that, you know, the third-way urbanism was limited, as indicated, or as illustrated rather, by the fact that Rob Ford won the election in 2010. That is the overall point of that article, the Filion 2011 article. So I am allowed to cite the article as a whole without indicating a page number on which a particular point appeared, because it's a summary of his whole point in that whole article.